Cheng Yan felt as if someone was calling him. "Your Highness, wake up." He turned his head away. But the sounds he had heard did not disappear. Instead, they became even louder. Then, he felt someone gently tug on his sleeve. "Your Highness, my royal prince." Cheng Yan opened his eyes immediately. He did not see any of the things he had grown familiar with. The screen was gone. The desk was gone, and so too was the wall which he had plastered with post-its. They were replaced by a strange scene, rows of small brick houses, a round public square that was crowded with people, and a door-shaped gallows that was erected in the middle of the public square. He was seated on an elevated platform from across the square. The chair he sat on was not his usual soft swivel chair, but instead, a cold and hard iron chair. Sitting alongside him was a group of people whose gazes were fixated upon him. Among them were a few young women who were dressed as medieval ladies like what he had seen in Western movies. And they were busy giggling among themselves. "Where on earth is this? Wasn't I working urgently on my blueprints?" Cheng Yan's mind was vacant. Perhaps caused by 3 consecutive days of working overtime that had pushed him to the limit mentally and physically. All he could remember was when he finally broke down, his heartbeat began to palpitate unsteadily, and he wanted nothing but to lie on the office table for a brief rest. "Your Highness, please announce your verdict soon." The speaker was the person that had quietly tugged on his sleeve. His face was old, seemingly in his 50s or 60s, and he wore a white robe. At first glance, had a little resemblance to Gandalf from The Lord of the Rings. "Am I dreaming?" Cheng Yan thought as he licked his dry lips. Verdict T. What verdict? He soon knew. The people in the public square were all looking in the direction of the gallows, while waving their fists and yelling as loud as they could. Some even threw stones at the gallows. Cheng Yan had only ever seen such an ancient instrument of death in movies. The gallows of 2 pillars extending upwards about 4 meters from a raised base. The top ends of the 2 pillars were connected by a crossbeam, which was embedded with rusty metal rings for a thick yellow hemp rope to travel through. One end of the rope was tied to the frame of the gallows, and the other end was tied around the felon's neck. In this strange dream, he discovered that his eyesight was extraordinarily good. He would usually require glasses to read the words on a computer screen, but now he could clearly see every detail of the gallows, which was 50 meters away, without his glasses. The felon was hooded and her hands were tied behind her back. Her shabby gray garment was tucked into a piece of rag. Her body was so emaciated that her ankles, the only part of her body which was exposed, seemed like they could be broken by pinching them. It was her faintly bulging chest which gave away that she was a female. She shivered terribly in the cold wind. Yet she was observably trying hard to maintain her straight posture. "All right then," Cheng Yan thought to himself. Exactly what crime did this woman commit that so many people are waiting with indignation for her to be executed? As he pondered, memories suddenly came flooding back to him, and the answer to his question abruptly appeared in front of him. Cheng Yan's memories appeared, almost as if they'd suddenly been turned on, and he realized the cause of the situation, and the answer to his question, at almost the same time. She was a witch. Witches had degenerated after falling to the temptation of the devil and are now the incarnation of impurity. "Your Highness." Gandalf urged cautiously. Cheng Yan glanced at the old man. "OHHH. Actually, he's called Bharat and not Gandalf. He's the Assistant Minister of Finance, and was sent here to assist me with government affairs. As for myself, I'm the 4th Prince of the Kingdom of Grey Castle, named Roland, and I'm in charge of this place called Border Town." It was residents who caught and arrested the witch, and immediately brought her to the police station. No, it was the court of justice. The warrant to execute the witch would typically have been issued by the local lord or bishop. "Which?" In this case, winning me. His memory answered every question he had indiscriminately. It was as though this bout of memories was derived from his personal experience, rather than knowledge he had gained from his extensive reading. This confused him. A dream can never be as detailed as this. Therefore, is this not a dream? Could it be that I have traveled back in time to the dark ages of medieval Europe and became Roland? Have I transformed from an ignoble draftsman to a dignified prince? Albeit this piece of territory seems barren and backward, and I've never seen the name Kingdom of Great Castle in any storybook. Well, what should I do next? I shall leave aside the question of how something scientifically impossible like time travel happened. Right now, I need to end this circus. Before civilization, it was common to assign the blame for disasters and misfortune to these pitiful witches. But Cheng Yan could not accept that they had to be executed as well to satisfy the dark desires of the audience. He snatched the formal written orders for MBAROV's hands, tossed them on the ground, stretched his arms and said languidly, "I'm tired. The judgment shall be postponed to another day." Court dismissed. Cheng Yan did not act recklessly or without thought. Instead, this was in accordance with his memory's detailed recollection of the way that the prince behaved, and all he did was reenacting their willful manner. The fourth prince, Roland, was indeed this screwed-up and abominable, and he did whatever he wanted. Certainly, it was impossible for a 20-something unruly prince to be well cultivated. The members of the noble who sat with him seemed unsurprised. But a tall man wearing a suit of armor stood up and argued, "Your Highness, this isn't a joke. All witches should be put to death immediately upon being identified. Or else, what can we do if other witches attempt to save her? The church will get involved if they know of this." Carter Lannies. "This handsome man is my chief knight." Cheng Yan frowned and replied, "Why? Are you scared?" His voice, which was full of blatant mockery, sounded natural. How could a man, whose arms were thicker than a normal person's body, be worried about witches breaking into our prison? Does he really think that witches are the mouthpiece of the devil? Won't it be better to catch a few more witches? As Carter remained silent, Cheng Yan signaled to his personal guards and left. Carter pondered for a moment before he decided to catch up with the guards and walked beside Prince Roland. The other nobles stood up and paid their respects to the prince. But Cheng Yan could see the disdain and contempt in their eyes. Back in the keep, which was considered to be the castle in the south of bordered town, he ordered his guards to deny entry to the anxious assistant minister so that he himself could finally catch a brief respite. As a person who had usually spent 90% of his time sitting in front of a computer, he had outdone himself by speaking in front of such an audience. Using his newly gained memories, Cheng Yan located his bedroom, and then sat on the bed for a long rest which allowed his heartbeat to regain normalcy. At the moment, the most important matter was to clarify his situation. Why is the prince not proceeding comfortably in King's City, but instead sent to this desolate land? The answer popped up spontaneously and left him a bit flabbergasted. Roland Wimbledon was sent here to contend for the throne. It all started when the King of Great Castle, Wimbledon III, quizzically proclaimed, "The heirship of this kingdom will not be based on age, but instead the capability to govern." He then dispatched his grown-up sons and daughters to govern different territories, and after 5 years, he would decide his successor based on their level of governance. Although the ideas of meritocracy and gender equality sounded progressive and futuristic, it was difficult to implement in reality. Who could guarantee that each of the 5 children faced the same initial conditions? After all, this was not a real-time strategy game. According to his new knowledge, the second prince was given a much better territory than bordered town. In fact, Among the 5 of them, none had a place as bad as bordered town, and thus he had a huge disadvantage. Furthermore, he wondered how the level of governance would be assessed. By population, military power, economic standing. Wimbledon 3 did not mention his criteria, nor did he put the slightest restriction on their methods of competition. In case someone secretly assassinated the other candidates, what would he do? Would the Queen stand by and watch as her children kill one another? Wait, he carefully recalled another memory. That's right. Another piece of bad news is that the Queen died 5 years ago. Cheng Yan sighed. This was obviously a barbaric and dark time during the feudal era. The way that people wanted to kill witches recklessly was enough to give him a few hints. Yet, even if he did not attain heirship, he would forever be a bloody prince of great castle, and would be the lord of a realm for as long as he lived. Furthermore, so what if I become the king? There isn't internet or other comforts of modern civilization. Like the locals, the only fun thing I've to do is burning witches, and living in a city where shit is excreted and dumped anywhere and everywhere. Won't I eventually die of a Black Death? Cheng Yan suppressed his chaotic thoughts and walked up to his bedroom mirror. The man looking back at him in the mirror had light gray hair, which was the royal family's most distinctive feature. Although his facial features were regular, his face lacked a proper shape and seemed devoid of royal disposition. His pale face gave away his lack of physical exercise. He recalled from his new memories that he did not indulge much in wine or women. He did have several sexual relationships while in King's City, and all of them were consensual. He had never forced anyone into an affair with him. He also discovered a probable reason for his time travel. Because of his company's urgency to make progress on a project, his boss had arranged consecutive nights of overtime work for him that caused him to die of exhaustion. The victims of such a case were usually coders, mechanical engineers, and programmers. Forget it. No matter what, at least I got the equivalent of an extra life. And therefore I really shouldn't complain too much. He began to wise up to the fact that he would probably adjust to this life in the days to come. But that for now, the most important mission was to act well as the Prince Roland and not let anyone find out. Or else, they may believe that the devil had possessed the real Prince Roland, and immediately burnt him at the stake. So, most importantly, live well. Cheng Yan took a deep breath and whispered towards the mirror, "From now on, I'm Roland." And recalled were regarding his brothers and sisters, and what he found left him unsure whether to laugh or cry. Roland's eldest brother, the first prince, was a great fighter. His second brother was sinister and scheming. His third sister was aggressive and savage, and his fifth sister was extremely smart. What should he say? After living with them for more than a decade, his impression of them could be summed up in a few words. He knew nothing about the extent of their power, their subordinate officers, or their skills and talents. Just 3 months into his leadership of Border Town, the nobles had already stopped concealing their disdain and contempt towards him. It was evident that the fourth prince wasn't cut out to be a leader. Fortunately, when he left King's City, he was accompanied by 2 assistants, one for civil issues, and one for military issues, who were provided by the king, or else it would have been in a much bigger mess. When Roland woke up the next morning, he was repeatedly reminded by his maid, tired, that Assistant Minister Barov wanted to see him. Realizing that he could put it off no longer, he groped the maid's behind twice, as he recalled it was customary of the original Roland to do so, and told her to inform Barov to wait in the sitting room. He saw Tyre's face flush a bright red as she walked out the door. Suddenly, Roland thought, since Bordered Town is primarily involved in farming, is there a system of any sort in place? He yawned and mentally repeated the word system many times in his head, but could not think of anything. Indeed, novels were all fiction. Barov was waiting restlessly in the drawing room. The moment Roland appeared, he immediately hurried towards him and asked, "Your Highness, why didn't you order the execution yesterday? 1 day earlier or 1 day later? What's the difference?" Roland said as he clapped his hands to order the servants to bring breakfast in. "Have a seat and let's talk." It was in line with his memory that the chief knight preferred to ask questions in front of other people, while the assistant minister usually chose to talk in private. In any case, he could trust both of them to be loyal to him, even though they probably did so as part of their duty to the king. Just 1 day may be enough for other witches to appear. "Your Highness, this isn't like any other trivial matter. You cannot act as recklessly as before," Barov cautioned. "Why are you also saying this?" Roland asked while frowning. "I thought you could distinguish between rumors and facts." Barov looked bewildered. "What rumors?" "That witches are evil and are the devil's emissaries." Roland replied glibly. "Isn't this part of the church's propaganda? If we don't want them to interfere in our affairs, we should do the opposite of what they say. We shall deliberately not hunt down witches, and instead publicize to our citizens that these are all shameless rumors spread by the church." Barov was shocked. "But witches are really evil?" Roland asked in reply. "How so?" The assistant minister remained silent for a moment, as if he was guessing whether the prince was purposely making fun of him. "Your Highness, this problem can be discussed later. I understand that you don't like the church, but this way of causing conflict is counterproductive." Roland curled his lips. It seemed that reversing this myth about witches could not be done overnight, and he decided not to dispute it further for now. Breakfast finally arrived on the table, consisting of fried bread, fried eggs, and a carafe of milk. He first poured a full cup of milk and offered it to Barov. "You haven't had breakfast, right? Let's eat as we talk, according to the maid." Barov had arrived outside the keep at dawn, and therefore should not have had time to eat, while he decided to imitate the former prince's way of life. And he'd also decided to begin to change the way people perceived him a bit at a time. Although he had determined to imitate Prince Roland's way of doing things at first, he also wanted to make changes gradually. "The assistant minister is a good first target for my plan," Roland thought to himself. Making one's subordinates feel valued invariably makes them more motivated to work for oneself. Taking the initiative is always the most efficient way of doing things. "No." Barov accepted the cup of milk from Roland but didn't drink. He anxiously said, "Your Highness, we have a problem. 3 days ago, guards reported that a camp suspected to be inhabited by witches has been discovered in the western forest. They left in a hurry and didn't clean up their traces. The guard found this in the camp." He took out a coin from his pocket and put it in front of Roland. This was not a common currency seen in the kingdom, at least according to Roland's memories, and he had never seen such a coin. In fact, it did not appear to be made of metal. He pinched the coin in his hands and was surprised to feel that the coin was becoming warmer. The heat definitely did not come from the assistant minister's body, as it was above 40 at least, and it made him think of heating pads. "What is this?" Roland asked. "I thought it was just some foul trinket that a witch made. But it's actually more serious than that." Barov had to pause to wipe his forehead. "The printed pattern is known as the insignia of the Sacred Mountain and Magic Eye, which is the emblem of the Witch Cooperation Association." Roland rubbed the coin's uneven surface, and guessed that it was probably made of fired ceramic. Indeed, he saw that in the center of the coin was carved a mountain-shaped pattern. It was formed by 3 juxtaposing triangles, and the image of an eye was placed in the space between the triangles. The pattern's contour lines were very crude, and therefore he judged that it was polished by hand. Roland attempted to recall the two terms insignia of the Sacred Mountain and Magic High and Witch Cooperation Association, but did not discover any relevant information. It seemed that Prince Roland knew nothing about occultism. Neither did Barov expect Roland to have any knowledge about this. He continued, "Your Highness, you haven't seen a real witch before, so it's understandable that you're unimpressed. Like us, they can be hurt, they bleed, and aren't any harder to kill than the rest of us. But that's only for witches who don't have resistance. The lifespan of witches who receive the devil's power would shorten greatly, but they would obtain a terrible amount of power which ordinary people are unable to rival. Once the witches are fully developed, our armies will suffer greatly. Their appetite for disaster is extremely difficult to restrain or suppress, and they've already degenerated into the devil's minions. The church therefore formed a punishment army, which would arrest and execute any woman who was discovered to have the slightest chance of transforming into a witch. The king has approved of this decree, and in fact, these measures have been highly effective, and the incidents of witches wreaking havoc have greatly declined in comparison to 100 years ago. Rumors about the Holy Mountain, or rather, the Gate of Help, were derived from an ancient book of that era. Roland, while gnawing on his bread, sneered in his heart continuously. Although the histories of this world and the world he was from were very different, their historical trajectories were surprisingly similar. The church was still the church. He understood that religion was the real devil's minion and the real source of evil. Executing a person because a small sign was discovered and using God's name to set laws, and then to arrest, trial and sentence a person, were in itself a form of degeneration. The Prince Roland's memories of the church's misuse of authority corroborated with his views. Unaware of Roland's thoughts, Barov continued, "It's recorded in ancient books that witches can only find real peace in the Holy Mountain. There, they wouldn't be reverse bitten by their magic powers, and wouldn't be troubled by burgeoning desires. There's no doubt that the so-called Holy Mountain is the birthplace of evil and an entrance from the human world to hell. I think that only hell won't punish this bunch of degenerates." "How about the Witch Cooperation Association? What's their relationship with the Holy Mountain?" Roland inquired. Barov explained with a grimace. "In the past, witches acted solitarily, whether it was to flee or to live in seclusion. But in recent years, the Witch Cooperation Association appeared and made a difference. They wanted to gather all witches and find the Holy Mountain together. For this purpose, the Witch Cooperation Association would even lure other people to become witches. In the port of Clearwater, there have been many cases of female babies disappearing in the past year, and there are rumors that they were the doings of witches." 3. The witch named Anna, Part 2. After Roland ate the last piece of fried egg from his breakfast, he took a napkin and wiped his mouth before saying, "So, are you saying that you're worried that the Witch Cooperation Association will try to rescue the witch when they hear the news that she did not die?" "It's as your Highness says." Barov stamped his feet and exclaimed, "I hear that they're in a hurry and probably on their way to somewhere. Had that prisoner died, and then it can't be helped. But she's still alive. If those witches are crazy enough to steal babies, I'm afraid that they won't forsake a degenerated companion." Roland was somewhat confused, and he could not help but feel that there was something amiss about the situation. Why is it that my assistant minister and chief knight speak of witches as if they're a forthcoming and formidable enemy? The woman who's to be executed is a witch. Right. She's so thin that even the wind seems like it can blow her off her feet. If she truly possessed frightening power, why would she be standing there and awaiting her death? No, she wouldn't even be caught. According to the church's explanation, she's a devil incarnate, and therefore the punishment army and other military troops would suffer losses if they fought her. Yet, She was caught by the normal citizens of Border Town, and was tortured by every means possible up until she was led to the gallows. But there was still no sign of her frightening power. How did she get caught? Roland queried. I heard that when the North Slope mine area collapsed, she revealed her identity in order to escape, and was then captured by angry villagers. Barov answered. I've a certain impression of this matter. And it happened right on the day before I traveled through time, Roland thought. How did she reveal herself? The prince asked aloud. Well, I'm not sure. The assistant minister shook his head and said. The situation was very chaotic, and it could be that someone saw her using witchcraft. Roland frowned as he asked, Aren't you able to investigate the situation properly? Your Highness, our priority is to restore the production of the mining area, the assistant minister retorted. Half of our revenue is derived from the iron mine. And what's more, the guards have confirmed that someone at the scene was killed by witchcraft. What kind of witchcraft? Roland asked, becoming more interested than before. The head and a large part of the body were spread out on the ground, as if they were melted. They reminded people of burnt-out black candles. Barov's face was filled with disgust. Your Highness, you wouldn't want to see such a scene. Roland played with his silver fork as he pondered over the issue. Historically speaking, most of the victims who were hunted by the Witch Cooperation Association were innocent people, and thus, the witches bore the brunt of the church's and the ignorant people's anger. In truth, a small percentage of witches had sought their own deaths. This group of witches dressed bizarrely, and spent their days mixing all kinds of materials in large pots, claiming that they could predict the future and knew the conclusion of life and death. They based their legitimacy around a few tricks. For example, making use of a natural flame reaction to prove that they had obtained the power of God. To a modern person, these were nothing but some simple chemistry tricks. But in medieval times, it was easy to mistake them as godly phenomenon. As for melting people, the first thing that Roland thought of was a chromic acid solution. However, the preparation for this was tedious, and the process itself required the entire human body to be immersed in the chromic acid. Furthermore, the melting effect was definitely not as strong as the melting of candle wax, and chromic acid was the strongest of the known acids. Then how did she do it? If she relied on alchemy, that meant she could have been a chemist, which was very rare in the whole territory, but if not, Roland thought until here, and then said in a determined tone, Take me to see her. The assistant minister stood up in a flurry and accidentally knocked over the cup of milk that he had not drank. Your Highness, you want to see the witch? Yes. This is a command. Roland looked back and smiled at the assistant minister. In a way, he was thankful for Prince Roland's unreasonable style. As Roland walked over to the door, he suddenly paused and asked, Right. I always wanted to ask why we use the gallows. What? Roland reiterated his question. Why the gallows? Shouldn't witches be burned at the stake? Barov seemed puzzled. Is that so? But she's not afraid of fire. There was only one dungeon in Border Town because such a barren land could not afford to upkeep too many prisoners. Most criminals would face trial within a few days and either be released or executed. In addition to Barov, the prince was followed into the dungeon by the chief knight, the prison warden, the castellan, and 2 guards. The dungeon had a total of 4 floors, and its walls were made of hard granite blocks. It was Roland's first time in this kind of place. He noted that the deeper down he went, the narrower the hallway became, and the lesser the number of cells. He imagined that the builders probably dug a pit in the shape of an inverted cone first, and then piled it up with layers and layers of stone. This type of crude engineering project would naturally not provide for a good drainage system. The ground was always very wet and muddy flowed down the stairs, all the way to the last floor. The witch was imprisoned in the bottommost floor of the dungeon. Every floor down they went. The stench in the air became thicker. Your Highness, you're risking too much by doing this. Even she's sealed with God's locket of retribution. It isn't completely safe. It was Carter Lannies, the chief knight, who spoke. As soon as he learned that the prince was planning on visiting the witch, he immediately rushed over and pleaded with the prince to turn back. He did not accept the prince's command and refused to leave, not when the prince seemed to blatantly disregard his own safety. How could such a tall and handsome man be such a bugbear? Roland thought. He wished that someone would just sew Carter's mouth up. If you don't even dare to look evil in the eye, how will you have the courage to defeat it? I thought you knew that, he said. Before fighting evil, one must know one's strength. Reckless behavior is not courageous, Carter rebutted. You mean to say that you'll uphold justice against an inferior enemy, but turn a blind eye to a superior enemy? Roland challenged. No, Your Highness. I mean, Carter stammered. Before this, you were afraid of a witch raid, and now you're even afraid to see a little girl. My chief knight is indeed one of a kind. Although the chief knight was talkative, he was not proficient in debate, and thus was helpless against a smooth talker like Roland. Soon the party reached the bottom floor of the dungeon. This floor was many times smaller than the ones above, with a top cell of only 2 cells. The castellan lit the torches on the walls, and as the darkness faded, Roland saw the witch curled up in one corner of her cell. It was already late autumn, and the temperature in the dungeon was low enough for people to see white fog when they exhaled. Roland wore a fur coat with silk lining inside, and thus he did not feel cold. But the girl only wore a thin garment that did not fully cover her body, and hence her exposed arms and legs were frozen white. The suddenly lit up torches made her turn away and close her eyes. But soon, she was able to open her eyes and looked straight at the party. It was a pair of pale blue eyes that resembled a calm lake before the onset of heavy rains. There was no fear on the witch's face, and neither was there any sign of anger or hatred. For a moment, Roland had an illusion that he was not looking at a weak little girl, but instead a shadow that devoured flames. He felt as though the torches became a little dimmer. The girl tried to stand up against the wall, but her sluggish motion made her seem as if she could fall down at any time. Eventually, she was able to get on her feet and huddled her way towards the light. This was enough to make most of the party members gasp in horror and take 2 steps backwards. Only the chief knight held his ground and shielded the prince. What's your name? Roland patted the knight on the shoulder to indicate that he did not need to be so nervous. Anna, she replied.